Hello and welcome back to Rambling Rogues, the podcast for indie authors. This is our first podcast back of 2024.
Yeah.
We haven't been doing them too regularly for the past few months, but we're hoping to start getting them, kickstarting them again, and hopefully doing a few podcasts. One each month, ideally. It's the beginning of a new year, sort of. It's February now. We're a bit late, but
a bit late.
We, at the end of last year, we got a load of authors together and we talked about the importance of setting goals for yourself. If you haven't yet set a goal for yourself, it's probably useful to do so in your writing. Just doesn't have to be anything too specific, but having something to work towards, I think, helps a lot. So to maybe help people get started, maybe we'll just quickly talk about our own goals this year. What are your writing or drawing goals, would you say, Joe?
Well, writing goals, I want to try and get done this short story that I'm working on with Michael at the minute. I want to try and get that finished.
Yeah.
And I want to get a few of those done, to be honest, because we're doing a few.
Yeah.
We're
going to do our own sort of anthology, as well as the Rogue Animal anthology. We're going to do our own one.
Between me and Michael. So I want to get a few stories done for that this year. And I'm currently 2,000, 3,000 words.
Something like that. The first one, and I think I'm about 1,500 words into my first one.
So I want to get that finished.
Yeah.
And in terms of my drawing, I want to try and get my horror comic finished.
Yeah.
That I'm doing.
Yes.
So I really want to get that finished, actually.
Yeah.
And I want to at least get 2 more issues of the comic I'm doing with Michael finished.
Yeah. Well, we talked about that before. Oculus Box. So today's podcast is going to be all about adaptations. It's about taking an existing work and making it into something new. Later on, I'm speaking to Chris, who we spoke to last year about horror, but this time, again, we're talking about adaptations. But before we jump into that, I think it's useful to us to talk a bit about like our own experiences with adaptations, because I think whether you're someone who plays video games or watches a lot of movies or reads books or comics, you'll have run into an adaptation in some way. So what would you say your favourite adaptation is, Joe?
Ooh, I'd say the Lord of the Rings is my favourite adaptation.
I thought you might say that.
Like, they're done. I think Peter Jackson did very well in adapting the books to movie format. Yeah, really.
Yeah.
What about the worst adaptation?
Wow. There was something that. Well, I'll tell you one example of a bad adaptation that sprung to mind when I was thinking about this earlier. As you know, my favourite band is Pink Floyd. In the 80s, they made an album called The Wall, 1979, and they made to go alongside the album. It was a concept album, so it told a story. They made a movie of that, and let's just say it's not great. It's a little bit abstract, shall we say? Yeah. I mean, there's tons of bad adaptations. I mean, you think of most. If anyone who enjoys video games, if you ever watched an adaptation of a video game, 9 out of 10 times they won't be that good.
Yeah, so, I'd say the Assassin's Creed.
That
movie that was bad.
That was terrible.
Any anime adaptation apart from the newest One Piece one, that has actually been good. Yeah. Apart from that, pretty much all the other ones have been bad. Really.
Yeah. Was there a Death Note one or something that was pretty bad?
That was terrible.
Yeah.
But that rewrote the full story basically. It didn't adapt it. It just rewrote it.
And there's many examples of books being adapted into films and them not being particularly well translating very well, or the filmmaker going too far away from the original plot line. In fact,
I would say the Witcher series.
I was about to say that.
Because he left the show because of that. Really.
The most recent series, they've apparently gone too far away from the books for Henry Cavill, is it?
Oh yeah. He didn't like it, so
that I mean, to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the Witcher video game or the show.
I'm not a fan of them.
Have
you ever actually played?
Yeah, I played a little bit.
Have you played Witcher 3?
A little bit, not much.
Well,
I've dabbled.
You should play more then.
Yeah. Well, anyway, So what are your favourite adaptations? Let us know in the comments somewhere. On Facebook
and let us know your least favourite as well.
Yes,
the ones you hate the most.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, let's jump into our interview with Chris. I think you were the first guest on the podcast.
Oh my God, I was
ever. Last year.
Well, I'm here in the flesh.
But you're actually this is a bit weird. It's the first time we actually have the guest in front of physically.
Yeah. Well, there were goblins in the machine last time.
Yes, there were, weren't there? Yeah. But last time we were talking about horror and about the concept of making things scary.
Yes.
This time we're talking about adaptations. We may even have touched on the topic a little bit because I think we talked about. I think we mentioned the Target books, which we'll talk about shortly.
I think, if memory serves, and this sounds about right, certainly where you or I were concerned, we went off on a Doctor Who tangent for about half an hour, and then it got edited out of the eventual episode, probably for good reason.
Yes, yeah. I think there were. Did we keep some of it in? I can't remember.
I can't remember either. But it's difficult for me because we were talking about horror, and my introduction to horror was being scared by Doctor Who monsters and loving it as a kid. So I can never disentangle the two. Yeah. But also, in terms of Doctor Who as a TV show, it's primarily made for and consumed in that medium. And yet, to me, Doctor Who is just linked to books because I've been such a huge Target fan.
Yeah, hold that thought.
I will.
I'm going to mention that. So, today we're going to be talking about adaptations.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about in relation to an episode of Doctor Who. But for people that don't know Doctor Who, it's going to be a broad discussion about adaptations. Yeah. So you'll still find some sort of usefulness in this.
It's about storytelling, ultimately.
Yes, exactly. So, before we get into all that, though, for those that didn't watch the previous episode, can you just quickly introduce yourself? And,
I'm Chris. I'm Michael's brother. It's just nepotism. That's the reason I'm here. I also have a couple of book podcasts. I'm the co-host on A Book at Breakfast, where we eat books and talk about breakfast, or possibly the other way around, can't remember. And I'm also the co-host of a brand new podcast called From Page to Screen, which appropriately is all about adaptations, but about the horror novels that inspired the titans of scary cinema, The Exorcist, The Silence of the Lambs, The Shining, that kind of thing. But I'm also a writer. My latest book that's out is called The Filed Witch, is a sort of folk horror. I've also co-authored Convent Crescent with Zoe Swan, which is a supernatural thriller, and Zoe and I are currently collaborating on a new horror novel, and I do bits of music and bits of everything, really, like anything to avoid just having a proper job and being sensible. Yeah.
Well, for anyone who hasn't checked out Chris's podcast, his are much more professional than ours. But I think.
Well, where's your breakfast? I mean, come on.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think you're pretty much available on all the platforms.
Yep. So. A Book at Breakfast and From Page to Scream are, Spotify, Google, Audible. Just search either title wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah. So, Chris, I've never heard of Doctor Who.
That's a lie.
but for the benefit of me and the other listeners who might not know, what's Doctor Who?
It's a British institution. Ostensibly, it's a science fiction show, but it's so much more than that. I think, and you joke that somebody might not have heard of Doctor Who, but we have a global audience now, and I suppose the way I would describe it, I think everyone who's British, whether or not they've seen a single episode of Doctor Who, they know that a blue telephone box is actually a spaceship in disguise that's bigger on the inside and travels in time. We all know that. It's just a staple of British pop culture. But to people perhaps who haven't grown up in and around the British Isles, who might not be as familiar with Doctor Who, the Doctor is Britain's superhero. There are Superman, only infinitely superior, because as Stephen Moffat, who used to be the showrunner of Doctor Who, once described the hero, he doesn't have a weapon, but instead we gave him 2 hearts to care twice as much. That's it. That's what Doctor Who is. It's a family show. It's traditionally always been on Saturday tea time at 7:00. Sometimes they move the slot, and that's wrong.
It's just sacrilege.
It's people call it a children's show, and I understand why, but it isn't. But it's a family show. It's designed to, I don't know. It started in 1963, and it was designed to fill a slot. Now that sounds quite cynical, doesn't it? It's like there was no grand plan. Nobody's dream, nobody's vision. It was just the executives at BBC needed a show to go in between. I think it was the football scores and whatever drama was on. And that might seem inconsequential, but therein I think the magic lies, because that is the golden spot where it's not quite, the kids haven't gone to bed yet, but the day is winding down and the adults are coming home from work or coming home from, settling down from their chores, and it's that wonderful period. It doesn't happen so much in the digital age, but this comes from a time when everybody, and when Doctor Who was first on, there were only 2 channels. Everybody in the country, more or less, was sat down looking at that screen, and its purpose was to unite everybody. And mediums have changed, and storytelling has changed, and culture has changed. Britain has changed, but Doctor Who is fundamentally the same thing. It is Britain's superhero story, and it is for everyone. That is the point of it. The point is that it belongs to everyone and it appeals to everyone.
Absolutely. And the fact is, even if you don't know Doctor Who, it's probably influenced a show that you are familiar with.
Undoubtedly. Certainly. It's been Bill and Ted, for example, they travel through time in a phone box. There's no way they didn't get that from Doctor Who,
It's often referred to as a sci-fi show, but
yeah,
to me, I mean, it's
fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the sort of same bracket as Star Wars, isn't it?
I think so. It's space fantasy, because something like Star Trek, I think it takes its logic and its science very seriously. That is science fiction or speculative fiction. But in Star Wars, the Force, well, it's just space magic.
Yeah.
And lightsabers are space swords. And similarly in Doctor Who, the Doctor has a sonic screwdriver, which ostensibly is a piece of technology, but it's just a magic wand in space.
Yes.
And the Doctor is a wizard in space. And the TARDIS, yes, technically it's a spaceship. Technically it's a vessel. What it actually is, in terms of how the stories function, the TARDIS is a magic carpet, because Doctor Who is a fairy tale.
Yes, yeah. So the particular episode that we're focusing on today has been adapted into what is known as a target book.
Yeah.
But is it strictly a target book?
It is. Yep.
It is.
Yep.
That's now a thing again, because
target books are a thing. So for anyone who doesn't know, we mentioned when Doctor Who started, there were only 2 channels, and back in those days, the BBC would. This is quite an unflattering and unpleasant term, but it's the word they use. They would junk episodes once they'd aired, which basically meant erasing the tapes. So not all of the original episodes of Doctor Who survive. A lot of the 60s ones are missing. They're turning up gradually in various corners of the world. And the ones that are missing, all the audio survives. So they've been creating either CG or animation recreations of the stories. But even by the time when we get to the 70s, when they were filming in colour and the BBC were keeping the tapes, there was still no home video. And even when home video became a thing in the 80s, most people couldn't afford it. The tapes were 20 quid each. The video players were, people generally in those days, it was on telly and then it was gone. You saw it once, and if you missed it, you missed it. And there was a children's, an imprint of a children's publishers called Target, and they did sort of adventure novels for children. And they started, and here's a great word, novelising Doctor Who episodes. So the children who missed them when they were on, or were too young to have even seen them, if it was the older kids in the 70s watching the first and second Doctor's stories, they could revisit those stories. Those stories could be immortalised. And to kids of a certain generation, and I'm technically too young for this, I am not of that generation, but for kids of a certain generation, target books were everything. I did grow up in an era of VHS, and Doctor Who was being regularly repeated on Sunday mornings and Saturday nights on BBC Two and UK Gold, I think. But regardless, to me, there was a dusty somewhat unloved corner of my school library that was full of these Target novelizations, and to me it was a real treasure trove. It was all of Doctor Who suddenly accessible, and I would pore over these incredibly exciting covers, most of which were by a Greek artist called Christos Achilleos, who very sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but his comic book inspired artwork, he was a big Marvel fan, so the covers are quite exciting. And there was this idea that Target books weren't relevant anymore because, of course, we now have the stories. But as time marches on and technology marches on, they do start to look dated. And the brilliant thing about those novels is that they don't date. They retain the stories, but the spaceships, you imagine them looking as good as anything in Star Wars. The terrifying jelly monsters in The Three Doctors, which was a story that I read the novel before I saw the programme. And the jelly monsters I thought were terrifying and almost sort of Lovecraftian in their weirdness. Then you watch the episode and they're just guys in bubble wrap,
And the Doctor Who, probably more than maybe any other show, has been adapted in so many different ways, because we've got the comics, video games, and obviously the radio plays. And I think there's something for the company's called Big Finish, who do all the the radio adaptations. I don't know how I completely feel about Big Finish.
There's a lot of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of it, and there's probably do you think there's more Big Finish than there is of the television?
Oh, easily.
Yeah.
If there was a random guy in the background of one episode in the 80s, you can bet your life he's got a spin-off series.
Yeah. And it's similar to sort of what goes on with Star Wars, how they did the whole thing of how C-3PO got his red arm in...
very much so. But yeah, it's great. There's so much crossover in story in Doctor Who. And a great example. Now, this is... I told myself I wouldn't go down this rabbit hole, but now I'm backtracking. So I said that Target started putting out Doctor Who novelizations, and of course that's true. But the first Doctor Who book... was actually called Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks by David Whittaker, and that was published, I think, in 1964 or 65. It was shortly after the serial The Daleks had first aired, and it doesn't have the snappiest title, and it didn't have the coolest looking cover. So what Target did, they actually reprinted it a decade or so later, called Doctor Who and the Daleks, and gave it sort of very exciting comic book cover art. And then they started printing original novelizations. But I bring that up because the novelization of that story is very different. Because the thing about Doctor Who, it started... the first episode aired on the 23rd of November 1963. And the very first it gets confusing because in those days there would be a serial, and that was what the term was for a story told over 4 or 6 or even 9 episodes sometimes. And in the 60s, each episode of the serial would have its own individual title. So the first ever episode of Doctor Who was called An Unearthly Child, and it is incredible. If you go back and watch it now, 60 years later, it still stands up as a wonderful piece of television, but also it's crazy to think how much of Doctor Who is contained within that episode. All the ingredients are there, the mysterious Doctor, the companions, the contemporary Earth setting, the discovery of the TARDIS, which is actually bigger on the inside, and the humans' reaction to it, and then they get, transported through time, and, it's absolutely incredible. Unfortunately, the rest of that serial is pretty much unanimously regarded as quite boring and not very good. It's about 6 episodes of cavemen. I think it might only be another 3 episodes, but it drags. It really drags. And then, thankfully for Doctor Who, the Daleks came along quite soon after and changed everything. But I bring that up because in the novelization, they kind of dispense with all of the boring caveman storyline, and they start with Ian and Barbara, who are the Doctor's original companions, discovering the TARDIS, and instead of going back to the Stone Age, they go to the planet of the Daleks, Skaro, and it's all much more exciting. But it's really interesting because it changes the lore completely. They're not teachers, and they don't follow Susan, the Doctor's granddaughter, home from school and find that she's living in a box in a warehouse. There's a completely different storyline about Barbara being in a car crash and Ian trying to help her, and they go to a police box on a foggy common to try and call for help, but of course it's not really a police box, it's a time machine, and that's the story changes in that medium. But then a few years later, Amicus Films made a big screen adaptation of that same Doctor Who and the Daleks with Peter Cushing playing the Doctor. Except he's not the Doctor from the TV series. He's a human scientist called Doctor Who has built his own TARDIS. And so that same story about Ian and Barbara and Susan stumbling into the TARDIS and going to Skaro and having an encounter with the Daleks, that's already been told 3 times, even just in the 60s. And each iteration is slightly different. And each iteration has given us something that stuck and carried forward into the Doctor Who lore.
Yeah, and it really does illustrate that how sort of a prime target for adaptation Doctor Who is, really.
Massively, you mentioned Big Finish, because when Doctor Who was sort of not cancelled exactly, but taken off air indefinitely in 1989, and it didn't return until 2005. So that was quite the hiatus. And during the 90s, the stories were sort of semi-officially continued. Target had kind of wound down by then. And it was Virgin Publishing who took on the Doctor Who range. And by that point, all of the classic stories had already been more or less novelised. Copyright permitting. So they actually got a load of young writers such as Russell T Davies and Mark Gatiss and Paul Cornell, like young guys in their 20s who were Doctor Who fans, to write original Doctor Who novels featuring the 7th Doctor, Sylvester McCoy. And what's amazing about then in Big Finish, some of those stories like Love and War, for example, or Damaged Goods, The Long War, I think it's called, they were adapted to audio with original Doctors. They've got Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred, and they've got Tom Baker, and it's wonderful. And then even some of those novels, or one of those novels, I should say, was Human Nature by Paul Cornell, which of course ended up being adapted to an episode for the David Tennant era. So like these same stories keep being recycled. That's an unflattering term. Reimagined, I should say, between mediums. And it's so exciting because it feels like they're alive. They're not fixed.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you said, it wasn't that long ago as well with the episode. I won't say what the series number was because that's getting too. But there was an episode that was adapted. Well, it wasn't adapted, but it took elements of a radio play, Spare Parts, and made it into an episode, which shows that that's still happening. It's a continuous.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the Star Beast.
Yeah,
was a comic book.
Yes, of course.
In the 70s,
it was. Yeah. So I guess more broadly, then adaptations are extremely important in that they can not only bring an extra dimension to a certain story, but they can actually inform future stories as well.
Yes. Yeah, and I think there's a reason that Human Nature, which I've already mentioned, was very highly regarded among the they call them the New Adventures, even though they're about 30 years old now. And I think it seemed inevitable that would be adapted for screen. But I think there's something in there, isn't there, about how something occupies a special place in someone's heart to the point that they want to revisit it. And and a great example of that is the Star Beast, because Russell T Davies was a young fan reading Doctor Who magazine, which includes a regular comic strip, and something about the Star Beast really struck him and stuck with him for all those years that he wanted to reimagine it later. And then David Tennant too remembered when he saw the script. He saw the title, The Star Beast, and he instantly remembered reading that comic as a 9-year-old boy. It's incredible.
Yeah. So, again, it just illustrates that long-lasting power of adaptations. So, obviously the biggest difference with any sort of adaptation when compared from a visual medium like television is the visual side of it, that you can do so much with.
It's a completely different way of telling a story.
Yes, and so how rigid do you think an author needs to be in terms of describing something that is shown within, for example, in Doctor Who, in the Star Beast, we've got various elements that are quite central to we've got the ship, we've got the creatures. How close do you think an author needs to? I mean, in this situation,
it's a good question because. The classic Target books, some of them were, among, I think, some of the best books ever written. And many of them were written by a guy called Terence Dicks, who was the script editor on Doctor Who in the 70s. And he wrote some of the best Target novelizations there have ever been. He also wrote some of the worst, because on a bad day he would just phone it in. And phoning it in for him was literally taking what was in the script and putting, said the Doctor on the end, And yeah, it's easy to be unkind there, because I'm coming at it from the perspective of someone who has at least seen the episode that it's novelising, or can then go out and watch it. But when you consider that the aim, the purpose of these books was to bring the story to people who might never have seen it when it was on telly, or might not, he has to describe it as it looked on screen. Whereas I think now, as we hinted at, so the Target books kind of wound down I think the last one came out in about 93 or thereabouts, and then they were kind of done. But then, of course, Doctor Who came back to our screens in 2005. And in 2018, the Target range was resurrected, and they've been novelising new era stories, which is just absolutely unbelievably wonderful for lifelong fans of not just Doctor Who, but the Doctor Who book novelisations. And I've forgotten where I was going with this. What was the question?
The question was about how close you have to be.
Oh, right, yeah. So the audience is very different nowadays, because I think we can all safely assume that the person reading the story will have seen it.
Yes.
And if they haven't seen it, it's only one click away on iPlayer. They're not writing for people who are constructing this story for themselves for the first and possibly only time. So I think it's all about, and this is the key difference between writing for screen and writing novels anyway, but the key is emotion and human emotion. So in terms of your question about how do you describe things like spaceships and aliens, it's not about describing what they look like. It's about describing how people react to them. Yeah. And I think Target books work, they're most effective when you have the most ordinary narrator possible. Someone who isn't an alien, someone who certainly isn't the Doctor. I don't think it should ever be from the Doctor's point of view. Sometimes it is, not every, some writers are different, but the Doctor to me should be ancient and alien and unknowable.
I don't know how you even begin to do that. Yeah.
But also, if a Doctor saw a spaceship, he'd say, oh, that's a Gestelican Schwoonverruser. Whereas you want, Clive from Shoreditch to say, oh my God, I saw this thing and it was like something out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, because I can relate to that, because I'm just a guy, And what I absolutely loved about immediately when I began reading The Star Beast, I had the biggest grin on my face. I may have even texted you at the time, because it begins very differently to the episode as on screen. We get somebody observing events, and he's a completely ordinary-ish guy, and he's witnessing what's happening in Camden that day. And it's chapter 1, The Hunt, and it begins from the perspective of a character called Stu Ferguson. And it says, Stu Ferguson pulled the collar of his coat up round his neck and shivered as he walked through the night on his way to his overnight cleaning job at the steel works. Weird thing was, it hadn't been cold a few seconds ago, but as he'd passed Blackcastle Passage just now, a gust of wind had whipped around him and surprised him. OK, Camden at the start of winter was never the warmest part of London at the best of times, but that had been a very sudden blast of icy air. Stu realised it had faded away, and he tentatively pulled his collar back down, peering up Blackcastle Passage, a small mews-like walkway which led to the back entrances to many of the shops that ranged along the high street. He was quite surprised to see a tall, thin guy in a long blue coat, his hands in pockets, whistling to himself, strolling towards him, his brown hair blowing slightly in the breeze. Odder still, Stu thought, was the massive blue box behind him. Stu could normally see the back doors of the shoe shop from this angle, but tonight that weird blue box was in the way. "That your box, mate?" he found himself asking the thin man. "I'm sorry," said the man, his voice betraying his most likely South London origins. Oh, that box. No, that box something to do with me. Oh, no. Then he threw a look directly back down the passage at the box. Because if it was my box, it wouldn't have just kicked me out. It wouldn't have just dumped me here and locked its doors without so much as it... The man stopped as he realised Stu was gaping at him. Sorry, I tend to go on a bit. Stu had a sudden feeling of... What did they call it? Deja vu. He had met this bloke before. Maybe working at the steelworks? Nah. So maybe he'd been a customer back in his milk round days? There was something tickling on the tip of Stu's mind about him. Oh well.
Wow.
That's a deep cut for the fans. So not only do we get this completely ordinary bloke in Camden witnessing the arrival of the Doctor and the TARDIS.
Yeah.
There's a brilliant, and this is what Target books do so well, there's a little Easter egg for the fans there. And we eventually find out who Stu is, but for the, you know, the what's the word? The keen... I was about to say eyed, eared. The observant among you will have got it with Milk Round.
Yeah. But in terms of just the wider topic of adaptation, there, the idea of completely shifting the narrative away from the way the actual episode started to this other character is quite an interesting way of doing it, because it sort of achieves that same emotions that you get when watching it.
It's literally just what was described, but there's a monologue, isn't the Doctor? But the action starts just the TARDIS arrives, and we're the observer. But in the novel, there has to be a narrator, and when it's just kind of third person omniscient, it's not quite as engaging to say, you know, there was an alley and there was a wheezing and groaning of. That's great, but to actually
that's it.
Give it a lens, you know.
There's a lot of visual. You get two characters reuniting, and we get the visual side of it, and a lot of that is so much is in. Well, I was gonna mention this in a minute, which is so much of it is in the unspoken.
Yes,
you know? That's and the way they've done that is they've again brought it from a new angle but achieved the same effect, which I think is quite impactful.
If anyone's wondering, by the way, Stu Ferguson, it turns out, is the milkman who appears at the beginning of The Stolen Earth, which is the sort of the first of a two-part season finale on what was actually David Tennant's, as the 10th Doctor's final season. Though, of course, David Tennant is now back as the 14th Doctor in this story.
So, just continuing from that point that I mentioned earlier, in Doctor Who, we have this fantastic soundtrack by Murray Gold.
Oh, yeah.
And through that, we're able to sort of conjure so many emotions for the
viewer.
Yeah. Obviously, an author doesn't have access to that. How do you go about, as an author, replicating those moments?
That's really interesting. That's a great question. But I think it goes back to what I said earlier about you. That's why you can't just write down what's happening on the screen. Because, as I say, filmmaking or television, you know, visual media, it's such a fundamentally different medium that you can convey tone and you can convey emotion just with aesthetics and, crucially, music, especially if it's music by Murray Gold. And that's why, I'll give you an example. If you're a fan, that moment where the Doctor... And let's not beat around the bush. David Tennant was a favourite. He's most people's favourite Doctor. And there was a great collective kind of joy at his returning to the role. And that's, in case you're listening and you're not massively familiar with Doctor Who, periodically the Doctor's face will change, shall we say. And it's an excuse to get a different actor to carry on playing the character so that the role can go on forever while the actors come and go. And, of course, you know, previous actors who've played the role crop up every now and again for a cameo or an anniversary episode. But David Tennant, having played the 10th Doctor, then came back shamelessly, unapologetically, to then play the 14th Doctor. And it was just brilliant and everyone loved it. And that moment when he walks out of the TARDIS in that alley in Camden, the music swells, and Murray Gold, who again had left the show in 2017 and was back again to much jubilation, the music that plays in the background of that shot was actually the Doctor's theme from back in the day. And to those of us who knew and remembered, it was this huge swell of emotion of going, I mean, I'm old, but certainly you're younger than I am. for you, seeing David Tennant on the telly again, that's, oh God, it's my childhood.
Yes.
It's the Doctor.
Yeah,
it's my
much.
Doctor.
Yeah.
And it's so clever in the novelisation that, there's no music. Well, of course, there was because I was listening while I was reading. But that's by the by. But what the author has done, it's not just a person observing it. It's a person who remembers David Tennant's Doctor from 2008. And he goes, oh my God, it's you. You're back. And it's a way of conveying that same emotion, but with words rather than music.
Yeah, because in the episode we have the moment the TARDIS lands, I think, they play his very iconic theme.
Yes,
and that's basically achieving the exact same effect.
Exactly,
but through
exactly.
Yeah, wow. So, one of the restrictions of writing for TV is that you have to keep to a very rigid framework. You've got, in terms of Doctor Who, it's a 45-minute episode.
Yeah.
But with writing a book, you've pretty much got limitless space and you can do what you want.
Yeah.
So how important do you think in terms of adaptations it is to add your own, add extra context, extra scenes?
Yeah. I think that's what makes them what they are.
Yeah.
For all I talk about sort of posterity and kind of bringing older stories to a younger audience who won't be put off by old-fashioned hairstyles or low budgets or whatever. I think what it really is, it's extra. Yeah. We want more, and there's nothing quite like getting a novelisation of your favourite Doctor Who story.
Yeah.
To find that there's more of those characters, more of that world. And my favourite Target novelisation of all time, I brought it with me. It's The Curse of Fenric by Ian Briggs, and this novel was written by the same guy who actually wrote the teleplay, as they called them back then. And it's absolutely wonderful. We mentioned, Doctor Who originally, its original run started in 1963 and it was sort of taken off air in 1989. And the BBC didn't love Doctor Who in those days. They weren't giving it the time, the money, the attention, the promotion it deserved. And those late 80s episodes have got a bit of a bad reputation, and some of them justifiably. But what a lot of people don't know is that shortly before Doctor Who was cancelled, it got really good again. It got really, really good. It got as good as it had ever been. And Sylvester McCoy's final series is spectacular, and the way his Doctor changes from being a bit buffoonish to being suddenly kind of Machiavellian and dark and complicated and mysterious, and a lot of the darkness of more modern Doctors, like your Capaldis and your Tennants, it comes from Sylvester McCoy. So go and watch the final series of the original run. You won't be disappointed, and read this novelisation. It's fantastic. And this story, it's set somewhere on the North Yorkshire coast in the 1940s, and spoiler alert, there are vampires. I won't go into more details, but it's very much my cup of tea. And peppered throughout this novelisation, as well as being an incredibly faithful recreation of the story, there are various documents peppered throughout it. And this is document 3, and it's titled A Victorian Storyteller. And it's a letter from Abraham Stoker to his wife Florence, and and it's written from Whitby in 1800. My dearest wife, I was delighted to receive your telegram this morning, and I await your arrival here with eager anticipation. Sir Henry and I travelled to Scarborough yesterday with a view to attending a performance by Mr. Grossmith at the Spa Theatre, and a curious circumstance occurred during our journey. And he talks about, stopping by somewhere and being told a curious local legend about creatures that devour the blood of humans and that they are afflicted with eternal life. And he says, to think, my dear, that we have vampires living on our own islands. Naturally, the whole episode was buzzing in my mind for the rest of the day, and even now the story will not leave me in peace. I begin to believe that the seeds of some greater story may lie in this tragic incident. Perhaps I shall know better when you arrive. Your beloved husband, Bram.
Wow.
And it's, of course, Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. Because most people don't think that his name is Abraham. This is what Bram is short for. But yeah, if you know, you know. His wife was called Florence, and he references Sir Henry Irving, who was an actor that Stoker worked with at the Lyceum, and he was greatly enamoured with him. Some people say in love with him. So all the little clues are there, and it's Whitby, and it's but that's in the TV story as broadcast, it's just the North Yorkshire coast.
Yeah.
Never says where. And you're thinking, well, obviously it's Whitby. Obviously, and then the novel gives you that little detail, and it links Dracula to Doctor Who. And as a lifelong Dracula fan, I loved reading that so much. And that's what the novelizations are.
Yeah.
You know,
well, what I love about that is that it's an adaptation, sort of out of an adaptation.
Yes, literally, yeah.
So it shows how deep you can go with these kind of things.
Yeah, really.
So we touched on the visual elements that TV offers, but are there things that books can offer that TV doesn't offer? I think the answer is definitely yes.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, as I said, I've said this a few times. They are just fundamentally different mediums. Yeah. And at the risk of stating the absolute obvious, and maybe you need to get a better guest in future, the things that books have to offer are words. Yes. Now, obviously, like there are words in TV programs, unless it's Hush. That episode of Buffy was when they were speaking. But poetry might be a better way of wording it. And I'll give you an example back to The Curse of Fenric. It's not just describing what's happening on screen. It has poetic license. It begins... The prologue is called Dusk, suitably vampiric. And it begins... Every story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it's never that simple. Think of the planet Earth spinning gently around its sun. Someone standing on one side of the planet sees the sun rise on a new day, like the beginning of a new story. But on the other side of the planet, the sun is disappearing beneath the horizon. For someone standing there, it's the end of a story. Sunset in one place is sunrise somewhere else. And for someone who is standing between them, it's the middle of the day or the middle of the night. It all depends where you're looking from. All the time, the earth slowly turns, joining all the stories together day after day, year upon year. They are joined into one long story with no beginning and no end. However far you go back, you can only ever find a first beginning. Edit that. However far you go back, you can never find a first beginning. There's always something earlier. Does this really matter? Of course it matters. How can you expect me to tell you the story if I don't know where it begins or ends? I could start with a woman standing alone on a beach, but is that really the beginning? Who is she? What brought her here? We might reach the middle of the story and find out that something important took place 10 years earlier, or even 1,000 years earlier. We'd be in a fine mess then, I can tell you. Yes, I know. I'm just a grumpy old man, and you want me to shut up and get on with the story. You don't mind where it begins, just so long as it begins somewhere, and I stop talking all this nonsense. All right, then. We'll begin with a woman standing alone on a beach. But don't say I didn't warn you.
Wow.
I mean, how powerful is that?
That is, yeah.
And, funnily enough, it says something might have happened 1,000 years earlier. And, of course, in this story, it did, because Fenric, to which the title alludes to, is this ancient evil that was bound by somebody who is quite obviously the Doctor, many, many years before. It's that kind of intimacy, that relationship. And I love that first person, there is a narrative voice. And it addresses the reader directly. And there's an intimacy to it. And it kind of... it uses words in a way that are memorable to cement things, to weave story and to create images. Now, obviously, there is dialogue, incredibly wonderful and powerful dialogue in TV series, but I would say that words aren't used in the same way.
Yeah.
Because there's so much else. There's so much else to rely on. Facial expressions, body language, Murray Gold's music, editing, even things like the colour palette of a scene can affect the way you react to it emotionally. When it's just words on a page, you need to bring so much more as an author, and with that authorial voice, that narrative personality.
Yeah, and I think that's why so many films, that are very iconic, but maybe don't always have the best dialogue.
Yeah. It's incredible when you write things down and strip that. It feels lacking somewhat.
You can even say that about music as well. There's so many songs that are great, but if you
lyrics,
look at the lyrics,
because it's not. If you take something like, I don't know, "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" by Dylan Thomas, one of the most powerful things ever written, I think. And when you look at those words, it's always more powerful in some ways to hear them read out, especially if it's someone like Michael Sheen. But just to see those words on the page, rage against the dying of the light. It's all there because it's 100% words. When you think of what you consider the best lyrics of all time, it's 50% words, 50% vocal delivery.
Yes.
And when you see those words written down, no matter how powerful, no matter how beautiful, no matter how memorable, there's always something a bit missing. So just something.
Yeah.
And it's
absolutely.
the human voice,
Yeah. So what do you think about the idea that an adaptation can lead into something else? And by that I mean an idea from an adaptation can grow into something else, maybe even into an entire new canonymity or...
Yeah. It's kind of what we were saying earlier about specifically in relation to all these Doctor Who stories that keep, re-emerging throughout various media, whether it's a comic book and then a TV episode and then a novelization in the case of the Star Beast. And sometimes it might be, a novel, an original novel that then becomes an audio drama, and that might become a computer game. And every time somebody adapts that story, they bring a bit of themselves to it, or even if it's the same person, they're adapting it many years later. And a great example of the thing that you just mentioned is I mentioned that Doctor Who returned triumphantly to our screens on Saturday night 7:00 in 2005 with an episode called Rose, written by Russell T Davies. And then when the Target novelizations returned in 2018, Russell returned to that story and novelized it. And of course it was the same story, written by the same man, but he was, 13 years older. A lot had happened in Doctor Who since then. A lot had happened in Britain since then, And so the story doesn't change. It's fixed in some degrees. It has its points that it has to stick to, but it morphs somewhat, shall we say. And within that, there are little vignettes, and there's a character, a much loved character called Clive in that story, who very sadly dies. But he's given a backstory in the novelization. And I mentioned how I think that the late 80s Sylvester McCoy era Doctor Who is sort of criminally underrated, and there is a wonderful story, Remembrance of the Daleks, by Ben Aronovich, who went on to write the incredibly successful Rivers of London series. You probably know of him as an author. But he wrote that and he novelised it. And I'd say that novelisation is right up there with The Curse of Fenric to me. They're the two best Target novelisations. And that story begins, again, it's always nodding back to itself. It begins at Totter's Lane in 1963, which of course was the year Doctor Who first aired, and Totter's Lane is where the TARDIS was when Ian and Barbara first discovered it. And this time he puts the Daleks there, and there's a soldier. It begins with a soldier being gunned down by this mysterious alien weapon that the military don't understand and don't know what to do with. And it's that's just the beginning of the story. And then we find out in the Rose novelisation that Clive's father was that soldier. And that's led Clive down his path of wanting to know what the government are hiding about extraterrestrials. And that leads him to discover the Doctor. So on the one hand, it looks back. But then bizarrely, it seems to look forwards as well. Because at this time, Russell had long departed the show. Chris Chibnall was the showrunner. We had no notion that Russell was going to return to Doctor Who. I don't think he had any notion that he was going to return to Doctor Who at this point. But a very strange thing happens after Clive is murdered by the Autons. We get a little, not an epilogue to the book, but an epilogue to that story of Clive's wife raging at the Doctor. Yeah. Because she knew that all Clive's life he'd been obsessed with this mysterious stranger known as the Doctor, and had wanted to uncover mysteries about him and find him. And when he finally did, it led to his death. And she concluded that whoever this Doctor is, he's dangerous and he brings death in his wake. And she's not wrong. Clive said it too. And so she swears vengeance. She would find this Doctor and make him pay. And of course, that doesn't happen in the original episode. No. And we talked about this on a book at breakfast, and we said, it's almost like Russell is seeding a future villain or giving a backstory to a villain. And we say, who is it? Is it the terrible Zodin? That's a deep cut for the fans. We don't know. Thought maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was by the by. But now that Russell's back, you think, so what began as, going back to your question, a straight up novelization, suddenly it spins off because stories are alive and, especially in terms of like oral storytelling, they morph and they evolve every time they're told, depending on who's telling them and crucially who they're telling them to. And then suddenly this story has come to life and branched off and gone somewhere new. And at the time of recording, the very latest episode of Doctor Who is called The Church on Ruby Road, which has also been novelised. And it has a very tantalising post-credit sequence. Now, I'm sure you've all seen it by now, but in case you haven't, skip forward 5 minutes if you don't want The Church on Ruby Road spoiled. But there's a neighbour, I can't remember the actress's name, but she was in EastEnders, just sort of like completely ordinary, EastEnder London kind of old woman, sat on the street being nosy, complaining at her neighbours. And she seems completely ordinary until at the very last second when she watches the TARDIS materialise and she turns to the camera and seemingly breaks the fourth wall and says, "What's the matter? Haven't you seen a TARDIS before?" And suddenly, the internet blows up. Who is she? Yeah. Is that Clive's wife 20 years later?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Possibly, yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. Wow.
You heard it here first. But even if that's not the case, the point is, that novelisation, which was supposed to be just an adaptation of a story that already existed, had already been transmitted, had already been seen, and yet it was still alive, and it evolved and it grew and it became something more.
Yeah. So
yes, in answer to your question, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. And I think actually as a way to sort of ties in with what I think my final question will be, which is, how important are adaptations in the wider literary world?
I think the wider literary world, or even the literary world, is adaptation. There's a lot of snobbery around the concept of fan fiction. And obviously there are kind of legal and moral implications about using characters or worlds or whatever that are somebody else's intellectual property, and obviously they should own the rights to those things. They should be paid for those things. I mentioned Florence Stoker, to whom the letter is addressed in The Curse of Fenric. She was Bram Stoker's wife and widow when he passed, and then in 1922 there was a German silent horror movie called Nosferatu, which was blatantly an adaptation of Dracula, but they changed the names. Count Dracula becomes Count Orlok and things like that, and Jonathan Harker becomes a character called Hutter, but it is blatantly and shamelessly Dracula. And Florence Stoker was very upset because she felt that she should be getting royalties from that as the widow of the author of the original. There are, so not to diminish that aspect of it, but I think there's a snobbery around it from a creative point of view, and it is sheer snobbery and sort of blinkered, small-minded, ignorant snobbery, because everything is adaptation. In Beowulf, there is a reference to a small man coming in and stealing a goblet from the dragon's hoard. And Tolkien, who famously translated Beowulf, thought, who was that little guy who came in and nicked the goblet from the dragon? Yeah. And that's where The Hobbit came from.
Yes, yeah.
So many stories are just reimaginings or retellings of other stories, because that's, what I said about what people do, oral storytelling. When we retell a myth or some folklore or some superstition or an urban legend, every time we tell it, it changes. And I was recently, my friend Zowie gave a talk at the Grand. I don't know why I'm telling you that, because you were there. My friend Zowie gave a talk at the Grand in Blackpool, and we were both there. And one of the people in the audience was asking about the concept of folklore as oral storytelling and versus how novels tie things down and fix them. And he rather dramatically described novels as coffins for stories. And I see the point. I see his point. But what I thought was, but coffins are made of wood, and bodies are made of bone and blood and sinew, and it all rots. It's all food for the worms and food for the earth. And then from that earth grows new life. We grow trees and flowers. We're all compost, and all stories are compost. And yeah, perhaps one day a folk tale or a piece of mythology or an urban legend will be told orally for the last time. But the person who hears it will remember it, and they'll write a novel or a screenplay or a stage play, and elements from that story will be present in their story. And then they'll die, and then their work will be adapted to different media, and then it will fall into public domain, and people will recycle it and reuse it. And yeah, maybe that story was put in a coffin, but the coffin's gone now. It's decomposed back to the earth, and the stories have grown again and flourished. So adaptation is everything. Everything is an adaptation. When I've described these Doctor Who novelizations to you here tonight, I've put my spin on them. I like vampires and horror, so I read you the Dracula bit. But there's a million other ones. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all subjective, and it's all adaptation. It's all interpretation.
Absolutely. I think that's a speech that the doctor would be proud of.
Oh, thank you.
So, are there any thoughts you want to leave everyone with?
Go and watch Doctor Who and read Doctor Who books, and then write Doctor Who books, and then have them published and adapted onto telly, and keep telling stories, and tell your favourite stories. And if you think a story has been told to death and you think you've got no ideas, think what your favourite story is and tell it. Just write it down, because you'll be amazed of how much you bring yourself to it and your interpretation. And when you see it then written down, whether it's Snow White or the Epic of Gilgamesh or Beowulf or The Little Mermaid, you will realise that you've written your own version of it, and there will never be that version ever again in the entire history of time.
Well, thanks very much, Chris, for talking to me about that. That was a great conversation, and hopefully, I'm sure we will definitely be speaking to Chris on the podcast again at some point. Go and check out his podcasts if you haven't already. So at this point in the podcast, we talk about a book that has been sent to us by an indie author. This week, we're talking about Carney Folk, which is a novella by Craig Cordill. It's about a small town travelling circus which visits a haunted town in the early 1960s. This isn't a review. What we like to do is talk about three things that that we enjoyed in the story, and from that you can make your own decision about whether you might want to buy this book and read it for yourself. So the first thing that I enjoyed about this was the narration that opens the tale. It's a character named Finn, who is one of the carnival hands. He introduces us to the world. I found his narrative to be quite engaging and funny. He seems to have quite a dry sense of humour. The intro gives a good overview to the eccentric collection of people in the carnival. In particular, I found the character of Leopold, who is the ringmaster, to be interesting. He inherits the carnival from his father, who was killed in a monkey knife fight. In the concluding section, Finn arrives in town alongside a collection of others from the carnival, and they're planning to perform, but something isn't quite right. The town is deserted. Finn feels uneasy and is relieved when they finally get out of town. I find this whole section to be quite interesting, and I'm intrigued to see where it goes next. So that's just a quick overview for you there of Carney Folk. If you want to buy it or learn more, there's a link to the Amazon page in the description of this podcast. If you are an indie author and you'd like us to consider your book for a review or for us to talk about your book on the podcast, then there'll also be a link for that as well in the description. So that pretty much wraps up this podcast. Next time we're hoping to do an episode on what's quite a contentious topic, which is AI. Me and Joe and I talk about that a lot already.
Yeah, we talk about it a lot. Yeah.
And it's it's gonna.
I think it's a topic in everyone's mind at the minute, really. Yeah. With the advancements being made.
Yes. And what does it mean for us as creatives, and well, I guess the world in general, but more specifically, we're going to be talking about what it means for creatives. So next time, what we'd like to do is have a bunch of people come on with us, and we'll talk about the topic and get your insights. It can be comic artists, it can be writers, it could be an artist in general. So
it could be musicians as well, you know?
Yeah, whatever. We want to hear what you have to say about it and what you think it means. So so get in touch with us for that. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, and we'll speak to you again next time.
Bye.
Bye.